I should be careful if I were you. There were so many people at Hampton Court that day that there had to be 2 sittings at the banquet, and I was at the first, the main one. As I went to my place, a girl caught my eye and nodded slightly to me. I nodded back, and she came up to me, her face pink with smiles. Will Montague! It is, isn't it? Then I recognised her as Lady Catherine, who used to be Marjorie's friend, who came to play with us in the gardens at home. It felt like years and years ago. I knew it was you, but I heard the king calling you William Carrow, and I thought I must have been mistaken. Are you really Prince Edward's page? I nodded, proud. But what are you doing here? I'm a maid-in-waiting to Lady Elizabeth, she said, just as proudly. But there are lots of us. I stay at the palace at Hatfield. It's huge. It's like a village. What's she like? I was thinking about how much Marjorie would love to hear about this. She had always loved anything to do with Elizabeth and Mary. She's perfect, Catherine said. She can already speak 3 languages and dance and make music, even though she's only 6 years old. People say she's brilliant. But poor child, she talks about His Majesty all the time. She was so excited about seeing him today. He comes to see her at Hatfield sometimes, and he's very kind when he's there. But he really only has eyes for the little prince when he's around. Oh, I must go. A fanfare announced the entry of King Henry, and Catherine bobbed her way to her place. The king sat with the high-born aristocrats at the high table, and below him lesser nobles, the lords and ladies in waiting. Next came their pages and ladies' maids, and after us, lower servants. I tried to stay away from Percy, but he deliberately put himself next to me on the bench. So be friendly, I thought. I know my manners, even if he doesn't. I gave him the courtly, slow nod, and he returned it, but his eyes were ice cold. I turned away from him to talk to the page on my other side. My stomach was dithering with worry. Children were playing up and crying. Dogs were barking and snapping at each other. Bowls and goblets clattered on the table, and the more wine people drank, the louder their talking and laughter became. It was impossible to have a conversation with anyone, even if I had wanted to. Men stood round the hall holding branches of candles, hundreds of flickering lights, and they made the room so hot and stuffy that I could hardly breathe. I wished I could get rid of my heavy doublet. I ate more than I could manage, and still the food kept coming in procession. Salmon and venison and roast beef and stuffed boar, porpoise and crab, each plate held high above the heads of the servants, who went down on their knees to present them first to King Henry. Percy ate hardly anything. He took a tiny morsel of food from the serving platter and played with it with the thin fingers instead of putting it into his mouth. He disgusted me as much as the fat belching page on the other side of me who gorged himself until he was sick and then kept on gorging. I kept my eyes down, wishing I could just rise from my place and go. Then I felt Percy's cold hand on my arm. His pale eyes looked inside me. He put his mouth to my ear. I heard that you and your father are papists. I stared. Do you still follow the Pope's teaching? Do you accept the act of supremacy? I didn't know what to say. I knew that to follow the Pope was a dangerous thing. To deny that King Henry was the head of the Church in England was even worse. I go to chapel with Prince Edward, I said. It was true, but I still mumbled the Lord's Prayer in Latin in my head. And at home? I'm not at home, am I? I'm at court. Percy turned his head away, and I hoped he was satisfied with that. But he came back again, his mouth so close to my ear that I could feel his breath and the trickle of his fluffy chin. It made me shudder. Your father is never seen in the chapel at Westminster. Isn't that strange? He said. I find it very strange. So does my uncle. You know him? I nodded. Of course I knew him. What did the Duke of Norfolk have to do with me or my father? Why was he interested in whether my father prayed in the chapel or not? But Percy whined on into my ear, making the hairs of my neck crinkle up. Sir Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. That's my uncle. He is at the right hand of King Henry, his friend and chief adviser, and he finds your father's behaviour very strange. He is watching him. Yes, a humble clerk, but he is being watched. I should be careful if I were you. And so should your uncle, Lord Peter Carew. Oh yes, the whole family is being watched. A fanfare drowned out his hissing whispers, and he pulled his head away from me. I felt as if I could breathe again. Another dish appeared. It was a swan stuffed with a goose, and inside a duck, and inside that a pigeon, and at the centre a tiny quail. Percy groaned, but the courtiers cheered and clapped as if they'd been starving for a week. Prince Edward squealed in fright at their sudden noise, and King Henry, laughing, held him up for Mother Jack to take to his room. As she walked to the door, the little prince held out his arms to me, still sobbing. And then the king caught my eye and nodded to me to follow. It was unheard of that anyone should leave the hall before his majesty. I stood up, bowed deeply, and hurried away, trying to force Percy's words out of my head, trying to fill up my mind with stories of elves and fairies that I would tell to the prince while he fell asleep in Mother Jack's arms. I was safe, for a time, from Percy Howard. But I fretted all night about my father. I dreamed he was surrounded by hooded men with flashing knives in their hands. I dreamed of gallows on lonely hillsides and dark shapes swinging from them. I woke up sweating and scared. I had to warn him.